Target confirmed. It's the Imperial Navy battleship Yamato. All aircraft in attack formation. First bombing run. Okay, boys. Launch away.
There could be no denying the fact that throughout the course of their history, the Empire of Japan had managed to wield and put to sea one of the largest and most impressive battle fleets in all of history. This much is common knowledge, but aside from a few particularly famous ships, most casual historians don't know all that much about the battle fleet that Japan wielded, instead spending their time focusing on much more commonly known aspects of the Pacific War and the rest of Japan's conflicts. As such, many interesting ships end up falling under the radar, with many of them often having led extravagant and even action-packed service lives, sailing in at the forefront of many stories that undoubtedly deserve more time in the limelight. Hence, the purpose and meaning of this video. These are the stories of the ships and men that dedicated their strength and lives to the erstwhile protection and glory of the Japanese Empire, and eventually how they tried to stop its downfall. This video documents the life, service, and death of every battleship wielded by the Japanese Navy, from their humble beginnings with the ironclad Kotetsu, whose entrance into the IJN heralded the very beginning of the Japanese Empire itself, to the two massive giants of the Yamato class, whose dramatic deaths symbolized its downfall. This is the life, death, and story of every battleship wielded by the Japanese Empire. Kotetsu is most commonly attributed as the first iron battle line ship ever commissioned into the Japanese Navy. She was originally built, interestingly enough, for the Confederate Navy as the ironclad ram CSS Stonewall, probably the most powerful ship that particular navy would ever commission. Being an ironclad ram, the ship's armament was relatively small, featuring only a single 10-inch gun for her main battery, and two 6-inch guns as secondaries. Her most powerful weapon was her massive ram, which, if utilized properly, could sink a warship with a well-placed hit. The ship that would become Kotetsu, then named Stonewall, was originally laid down in France in 1863, although it was technically illegal for them to build ships for the Confederate Navy. This fact came back to haunt them when the ship was completed in 1865, as the fact that the ship was being built for the Confederacy somehow managed to leak out. To avoid getting into more trouble than they already were, France went back on their word and sold the ship to Denmark, who then realized that they thought they were buying the ship for less than they actually were, and promptly sold her back to the Confederacy. Finally being commissioned into the Confederate Navy in 1865, she was manned overseas by a Confederate crew and began sailing across the Atlantic for the US. However, this was already so late into the Civil War that the ship did not end up reaching the US before the war had already come to a close, and CSS Stonewall was surrendered to the Union literally that same year. After going through all that, Stonewall remained in US custody until 1867, when the Japanese reached out to the US in the hopes of procuring new ships. The Japanese purchased Stonewall for $400,000 that same year and renamed her to Kotetsu, thus becoming Japan's first ironclad warship. However, the voyage to take the ship to Japan lasted until 1868, by which point Japan as a nation was in turmoil. Due to the ongoing Boshin War, in which the US was taking a neutral stance, it was ordered that no military material was to be supplied to either of the Japanese forces, an order that countermanded the delivery of Kotetsu. Until the forming of the Meiji government later that year, Kotetsu continued to linger in US hands, finally being turned over to what was now Imperial Japan in 1869. Now officially part of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Kotetsu was dispatched on the final missions of the Boshin War. Elements of the shogunate had managed to establish a republic on the island of Izo, an act that was not particularly supported by Imperial Japan. As a result, Kotetsu was dispatched along with the rest of the Imperial Navy to attack the Izo Republic. During this deployment, she actually managed to see combat on multiple occasions, once almost being boarded by a group of samurai from the enemy ship Kai-10. During the Battle of Hakodate, Kotetsu led the Imperial Japanese forces at the head of the line of battle, where she spearheaded an attack that led to the sinking or capture of 5 enemy warships over the course of 6 days. This battle would effectively be the last action of the Boshin War, and the Republic of Izo would surrender later that same year. Kotetsu continued to serve with the Japanese Battlefleet after this point, being renamed to Azuma in 1871 and seeing further service as a guard ship during the Saga Rebellion in 1874. The ship managed to run into a typhoon that same year, and after one more stint as a guard ship during the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, she was eventually stricken from the Navy list in 1888 and subsequently was sold for scrap in 1889. The Fuso was the first iron battle line ship that was actually originally intended to serve with the Japanese Navy. Unlike Kotetsu, which was originally built for the Confederacy and ended up serving in both the US and Dutch navies before she made it to Japan, Fuso was ordered for the Japanese Navy with the sole intent of her serving there. Her design was a scaled-down version of the British Audacious Class, a central battery ironclad that used 10 9-inch guns for its main armament. Due to some pretty significant cost restraints, when Fuso was ordered from British yards in 1875, her design was only equipped with 4 9-inch guns, significantly less than the design she was based on. After being completed in 1878, Fuso made the journey from Great Britain to Japan, and besides grounding herself for a period in the Suez Canal, the ship made the journey to Japan without consequence. She was commissioned into the Japanese Navy that same year, immediately becoming the most powerful warship in their fleet. Fuso spent her time serving on normal peacetime duties of the Japanese Battlefleet, carrying out the traditional training missions and gunnery exercises that were so standard for the Japanese Navy, and she even ferried around the Emperor at one point. Fuso's first action came at the start of the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. Fuso had just come out of a refit at Yokosuka, and the ship still remained Japan's most powerful battle line unit. Along with a few other ironclad corvettes, the ship engaged a massive Chinese naval force at the Battle of the Yalu River in 1894, including the two ironclad battleships Dingyuan and Zhenyuan. During the battle, Fuso was at the rear of the Japanese column and ended up being heavily engaged by the Chinese ships. She was struck multiple times by 6-inch shells, all of which failed to penetrate her armor and succeeded in only killing 5 of her crew members. Despite nearly being rammed by the much larger Dingyuan, Fuso made it out of the battle pretty much intact, and continued serving off of China after that point. After the battle's conclusion, Fuso served a supporting role at the Battle of Weihai Wei in 1895, seeing almost no action at that engagement, and subsequently seeing no more combat for the remainder of the war. In 1887, she was on the receiving end of probably the dumbest collision I've ever heard of. During a gale, Fuso's anchor chain snapped, and the ship was somehow thrown into the ram of the protected cruiser Matsushima. If this wasn't already bad enough, the ship was then thrown around again, and struck Matsushima's sister, Itsukushima, promptly sinking after the second collision. As much as this sounds like something that would take place in my bathtub rather than in real life, the Japanese apparently decided that things could be a lot worse, and Fuso ended up being refloated and repaired. During the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the ship had some of her secondary 6-inch guns removed for the siege of Port Arthur, which were then promptly replaced by guns from the protected cruiser Akashi. After serving a supporting role at the Battle of Tsushima, during which she saw no combat, Fuso was demoted to reserve, and was struck from the Naval Register in 1809. After being relabeled as a miscellaneous service craft, whatever that means, Fuso was eventually sold for scrap in 1909. The first true battleship that came into the possession of the Imperial Japanese Navy was one that had, interestingly enough, not originally been built for service with the Japanese. The Shin-Yen, more better known under her original name Zhenyuan, was one of 2 Dingyuan-class ironclads built for the Chinese Navy in the early 1880s. Compared to later battleships, they were relatively small, but were still armed with the standard 4 12-inch guns and 2 twin turrets. As was somewhat standard for the time, the gun turrets were mounted en echelon along the sides of the hull, pretty much precluding any sort of broadside firing. Being some of the most powerful warships of their time period, their service life under the Chinese flag was rather lackluster. Both Dingyuan and Zhenyuan saw action during the First Sino-Japanese War, where they, interestingly enough, engaged Japanese forces on 2 separate occasions. Both Zhenyuan and Dingyuan led the Chinese battle line during the Battle of the Yalu River in 1894, the largest engagement of the war. As the 2 fleets crossed the paths of each other, Dingyuan was the first ship to open fire, targeting the Japanese ships at a range of 5,300 yards. Genuine quickly followed with another salvo, and the battle began to turn into a close-range brawl. The Japanese formation was mostly made up of an assortment of cruisers and old ironclad corvettes, but even so, their superior training and maneuvers managed to get the better of the Chinese. Before long, the Chinese cruisers Yangwei, Chaoyang, Zhiyuan, and Jingyan fell to Japanese gunfire. In return, the Chinese managed to heavily damage the old Japanese corvette Hiei, which was forced to fall out of line by the Chinese gunfire. As the remaining Chinese ships were either encircled by the Japanese or tried to withdraw from the battle, the two Chinese battleships began to be engaged by a large portion of the Japanese fleet. However, most of the Japanese shells were too small to penetrate the ship's armor, and Dingyuan and Zhenyuan made them pay heavily for their attempts. 4 12-inch shells from the battleships struck the auxiliary cruiser Saiko Maru, whilst a shell from Zhenyuan disabled the main gun of the cruiser Matsushima. At this point, both sides were running out of ammunition, and the surviving ships disengaged. Zhenyuan had been struck nearly 200 times during the engagement, but in testament to her design, none had penetrated her armor. At the end of the war, both battleships retreated to the port of Weihai Wei, where Dingyuan was subsequently scuttled after being struck by a Japanese torpedo. Her surviving sister was transferred to the Japanese Navy under the name Shin Yen. The ship continued to serve under the Japanese flag after that point, and by the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, Shin Yen was the oldest active member of the Japanese Battlefleet, although she still fought as a frontline unit. She missed the Battle of Port Arthur at the beginning of the war, but got her chance to engage the Russians at the Battle of the Yellow Sea later that year, where she took 2 hits from Russian gunfire. The damage wasn't crippling, however, and she continued to serve on the front lines, bombarding Vladivostok a few months later. Her real chance for glory came during the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where she formed the very end of the Japanese battle line. During the battle, she was left largely unengaged, and along with her squadron mates, managed to sink the supply ship Kamchatka. This would be the last action of her career, and following the end of the Russo-Japanese War, she was kept in service only until 1911, when she was sold to the breakers. 2 of her anchors are still preserved today, and a full-scale replica of her sister Dingyuan was recently constructed and is now on full display in Weihai Wei as a museum ship. The Fuji Class were the first proper battleships to enter service with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Originally ordered from Great Britain in 1894, the ship's intended purpose was, ironically enough, actually to counter the 2 ships of the Dingyuan class. In the end, neither of the 2 ships, Fuji or Yashima, came into service in time to meet their Chinese counterparts in combat. Their main armament consisted of 4 12-inch guns and 2 turrets, 1 mounted forward of the superstructure and 1 aft, setting a continuing standard for Japanese pre-dreadnoughts. Both ships participated in the battle and subsequent siege of Port Arthur during the Russo-Japanese War, where they engaged the Russian Pacific Squadron in the first battleship-on-battleship action in history. The Japanese battleships were spotted by the Russian cruiser Boyarin whilst trying to enter the harbor, and the battleship action quickly ensued. Due to the range of the engagement, the Japanese battleships chose to engage the Russian shore batteries with their main armament and focus their secondary fire on their battleship counterparts. This turned out to be a very poor decision, and the Japanese managed to accomplish little during the action. Whilst engaging the Russian ships, Fuji was holed by 2 12-inch shells, suffering 2 dead and 10 wounded, and forcing the Japanese to disengage for fear of further hits. This withdrawal would, conveniently enough, prevent Yashima from taking any damage. The 2 battleships resumed blockade duties around Port Arthur, and would subsequently come together to try and engage Russian positions on 2 occasions. Both times, the battleships tried blindly firing over mountains into the harbor, and accomplished almost nothing, with the only result being Fuji was struck by another 12-inch shell. During the later parts of the siege, the Japanese would continue to attempt long-range bombardment missions of the Russian positions, something that would not end up going well for Yashima. Whilst helping to blockade the port, Yashima ended up running into a Russian minefield and would strike 2 mines, holding the ship below the waterline and sinking her, remarkably enough with no casualties. Despite this loss, the Japanese continued to operate in the area, and Fuji would continue to operate without her sister, getting yet another chance to engage the Russians in late 1904. This came in the form of the Battle of the Yellow Sea, where Fuji formed part of the Japanese battle line. She spent most of the battle engaging her Russian counterparts with 12-inch gunfire, and was subsequently not struck in return. After the battle, Fuji continued to blockade Port Arthur until the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. This action saw Fuji again form up with the Japanese battle line, and again engage her Russian counterparts in fierce action. This time, she was not quite as lucky as she had been at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, suffering 12 hits from Russian gunfire, one of which struck her aft barbette and detonated her propellant charges. Despite this, Fuji gave a good account of herself, and would end up sinking the Russian battleship Borodino after one of her 12-inch salvos detonated her magazine. This battle marked the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and after the war came to a close, Fuji continued to serve with the Japanese Battlefleet all the way up until 1922, at which point she was stricken and disarmed under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty. Her hull continued to serve as a barrack ship and training center until 1945, and following damage from U.S. carrier aircraft at the end of the Second World War, she was scrapped that same year. The Shikishima Class was broadly similar to the Fuji Class in terms of design, and the differences between them were mostly minor improvements. The most distinguishing visual feature of the Shikishimas was their arrangement of 3 funnels, one of only 2 times that this was seen on Japanese pre-dreadnoughts. The 2 ships of the class that ended up being completed, Shikishima and Hatsuse, both commissioned in the first 2 years of the 20th century. The 2 ships generally operated together during the opening stages of the Russo-Japanese War, and both participated in the opening Battle of Port Arthur. This didn't go much differently for them as it would for any of the other Japanese battleships, and both ships of the Shikishima class suffered during the battle. Hatsuse was struck by 2 shells from the Russian battleships, whilst Shikishima was hit only a single time by a Russian 6-inch shell, a hit that somehow managed to wound 17 of her crewmen. The power of shrapnel, I guess. In the coming months, Hatsuse and Shikishima would participate with the rest of the Japanese battle fleet in the blockade of Port Arthur, and would continue to attempt to lure out the Russian battle fleet. However, the Russians had no intention of being drawn into battle, not yet anyway, and instead opted for a more subtle form of warfare, laying minefields, a strategy that would end up working only too well. Whilst participating in the harbor's blockade, Hatsuse managed to run into a Russian mine that detonated near her stern and shattered her steering. The nearby battleship Yashima moved rashly to assist her, and was subsequently also struck by a mine. Hatsuse had her engines cut upon striking the mine, and the battleship subsequently drifted into another one, this time having her magazine detonated. Hatsuse sank rapidly, taking with her 496 of her crewmen. With her sister gone, Shikishima would continue to try and fight the Russians alone. She again formed part of the Japanese battle fleet when they engaged the Russians at the Battle of the Yellow Sea in 1904, where she fought as hard as she could, but got nothing in return except for a 12-inch shell detonating prematurely in one of her main guns. However, she would make up for it at the Battle of Tsushima a year later, where she played a pivotal role in sinking the battleships Auxilia Baya and Knyaz Suvorov, and sank the Russian cruiser Ural with a well-placed torpedo. In return, she was hit 9 times by Russian gunfire, although none of them caused serious damage. After the war, she continued her frontline service until she was disarmed in 1923, and after a brief stint training submarine crews, was used as a training hulk and barrack ship for the rest of her active career. She survived the Second World War, and was subsequently scrapped in 1948. Following the overall success of the Shikishima class, Japan would continue to try and improve on it for their following battleships. Asahi was the next improvement, and like her predecessors, her improvements over her preceding class were mostly slight. The most visually distinctive of the changes was the dropping of her 3rd funnel. Like her preceding cousins, she was built overseas in Great Britain, and was commissioned in the year 1900. Asahi would see her first action at the Battle of Port Arthur in 1904. Despite not being hit, Asahi didn't accomplish much of anything in return, and was forced to withdraw along with the rest of the Japanese fleet. She would again engage the Russians later that year at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, where she scored the most fatal hit of the battle. 2 of Asahi's 12-inch shells struck the Russian battleship Cesarevich, or however the hell you pronounce that. I cannot pronounce Russian, holy killing the Russian admiral and throwing their battle line into confusion, forcing them to cede the action and retreat back to Port Arthur. In return, Asahi received a 12-inch hit from the Russians, which did minimal damage, although her after turret did suffer an explosion from 2 12-inch shells that detonated prematurely. Asahi would again engage the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, again forming part of the Japanese battle line. Asahi managed to get herself into a position during the battle where she was heavily engaged, being fired upon by the Russian battleships Borodino and Oryol for a large portion of the daylight action, although most of her return fire was concentrated on the Russian flagship Kii Suvorov. Asahi would damage the battleships with 12-inch gunfire, knocking out her rudder and allowing her to later be sunk by combined fire from Mikasa and Shikishima. In return, she would receive 6 hits from Russian gunfire, and would suffer 6 fatalities as a result. During the battle, Asahi would fire more 12-inch shells than any other Japanese battleship, narrowly beating out Mikasa with a grand total of 142 shells fired. After the war, she continued to serve on frontline duty until 1923, at which point she was disarmed. However, the Japanese Navy decided to put her to use as a submarine salvage ship, and after the conversion was completed in 1927, she was pressed into service in this new role. Used mostly as an experimental ship until the 1930s, Asahi also had the dubious distinction of being one of the only pre-dreadnought battleships to be fitted with a catapult and aircraft. She was brought out of reserve in 1937 in order to take part in the Second Sino-Japanese War. During the conflict, she was put to use as a troop, transport, and repair ship, even managing to conduct an amphibious landing on one occasion. However, she largely undertook experimental assignments until the start of the Pacific War in 1941, at which point she was properly given the assignment of being a repair ship. Having been one of the longest serving ships in the Japanese Navy at that point, the old battleship finally met her fate in 1942, when she was sunk by the submarine USS Salmon, going down with the loss of only 16 lives. Like Asahi, Mikasa was the only member of her class, with her design largely being based off of that of the formidable class battleships of the Royal Navy. Like her predecessors, she was built overseas in Great Britain, and was commissioned into the Imperial Navy in 1902. During the Russo-Japanese War, she saw extensive service as the flagship of the Japanese Battlefleet, leading her fellow battleships into combat at the head of the line. She was the flagship of Admiral Togo at the Battle of Port Arthur, where, like most of the Japanese ships, she failed to accomplish much of anything. Engaging the Russian shore batteries with her main guns whilst concentrating her secondary fire on the Russian battleships, Mikasa was struck by 2 10-inch shells which failed to do any significant damage. She continued to serve at the siege of Port Arthur for the time being, but met the Russian battle fleet again at the Battle of the Yellow Sea later that year. As the flagship of the Japanese formation, and sailing at the head of the battle line, she became the target of most of the Russian gunfire, and over the course of the battle, she was struck 20 times, knocking out her after turret and killing or wounding 125 of her crew. In return, she fired on the battleships Poltava and Cesarevik, although she failed to do any appreciable damage. Even after the battle's end, it wouldn't really be that long before she managed to engage the Russians again, although this time, rather indirectly. The ship launched small torpedo boats that attacked the Russian battleship Sevastopol whilst at anchor in Port Arthur, although, again, nothing really came of it. After this attack, she went back to beating up on Port Arthur's defenses, but would get her chance to engage the Russian fleet again at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. As the flagship of Admiral Togo, Mikasa steamed into the battle at the head of the Japanese line. Before the action commenced, Mikasa hoisted the now famous Z flag from her mainmast, signaling a predetermined message to the entire Japanese fleet. It meant, "The Empire's fate depends on this battle. Let every man do his utmost." With Togo still using her as his flagship, Mikasa again entered the battle at the head of the Japanese line, and as such, when the action started and the shells began flying, nearly every Russian battleship began directing their fire at the hapless Mikasa. Over the course of the battle, the ship was struck nearly 40 times by Russian shellfire, killing or wounding 113 of her crew members. However, she gave as good as she got, and it was primarily her gunfire that sank the Russian battleships Osilya and Kii Suvorov, along with damaging many others. This excellent performance by Mikasa heavily contributed to the winning of the Battle of Tsushima, and it was in large part due to her gunfire that the Russian battle fleet had been almost entirely destroyed. 6 days after the Russo-Japanese War had come to a close, Mikasa managed to suffer a magazine explosion in port, losing a further 251 crewmen to the explosion. However, the ship could not be put down, and she was salvaged and repaired, coming back into service by 1908. The ship continued to serve with the Japanese battle fleet until 1923, at which point she was decommissioned under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty. However, the Japanese public had grown so fond of the ship that a special clause was given in the treaty that allowed her to be preserved as a museum ship. Having her hull encased in concrete at Yokosuka, the battleship was opened to the public in 1926, being one of the earliest museum ships in the world. However, her condition had largely deteriorated by 1945, not helped by US aircraft targeting her with bombs in the late stages of World War II. During the occupation of Japan after the Second World War, her hulk was used as, weirdly enough, an aquarium and nightclub for US soldiers, further adding to her deterioration. However, efforts were made to restore the ship in the 1950s, and after an excruciating funding campaign, Mikasa was restored and reopened to the public in 1961. She remains open to this day, remembered for her incredible feats at the Battle of Tsushima, and for being the oldest surviving battleship in the world today. You can visit her today for around 600 yen, or $4, remarkably cheap for a museum ship. To this day, she still sits in Yokosuka, still proudly flying the Z flag from her mainmast. Like Shinyen before her, Iki was not originally built as a Japanese battleship. First constructed in 1886 as the Russian battleship Imperator Nikolai I, she was commissioned into the Russian Navy in 1891. By the time of the Russo-Japanese War, her design was rather old, and evidently so. Armed with only two 12-inch guns, both mounted forward of the ship's superstructure, her entire aft section was dedicated only to the officers' quarters, and as a result, ended up bearing great resemblance to the ships of the line of old. Although looking rather elegant, it was deceiving of her actual combat utility. Serving on and off with both the Mediterranean and Baltic fleets for most of her career, in 1905, Imperator Nikolai would, like most of the Russian Baltic fleet, be assigned to the 2nd Pacific Squadron and was ordered to sail to Japan. The massive Russian battle fleet made the grueling month-long journey to the Japanese coastline in two separate groups, with Imperator Nikolai being assigned to the Russian 4th Squadron, under the command of Rear Admiral Nebogatov. Upon reaching Japan, the Russians engaged a massive Japanese battle fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. The old ships in Nebogatov's squadron were largely out of the range of the first battle fleet action, and in the end, it would turn out to be for their own good. The old ships in Nebogatov's squadron were largely out of the range of the first battle fleet action, and in the end, it would turn out to be for their own good, as most of the most modern Russian ships were destroyed or crippled in the action on the first day. Retreating from the battle, the Russian ships were whittled down by Japanese torpedo boat attacks during the night, until eventually, on the next day, the Japanese battle fleet again caught up with them. The remaining Russian ships were surrounded by the Japanese battleships, all of which opened fire at a range of 11,000 yards, a distance at which the Russian guns could not reply. Realizing that his choices were either to let the men under his command die or surrender to the Japanese, Admiral Nebogatov ordered his ships to surrender. Imperator Nikolai was surrendered to the Japanese fleet as one of the least damaged of the Russian ships, having suffered only 5 hits throughout the battle. The old ship was taken back to Japan and was promptly commissioned into the Japanese Navy under the new name Ike. Although still technically fully combat capable, her age prevented her from seeing further use in the Japanese battle fleet, and Ike saw out the rest of her career used as a coastal defense ship and training ship. She was finally struck from the Japanese Navy in 1915, and in the end was sunk as a target later that same year. Like their predecessor, Iki, the two ships of the Okinoshima class were not originally built for Japan, and instead first entered service as the 3 Admiral Yushikov class coastal defense ships of the Russian Navy. Although built and labeled as coastal defense ships by the Russians, their large main armament of 4 10-inch guns and ability to sail long distances at sea really meant that it would not be so much of a stretch to call them small battleships. Even if you don't technically consider them part of Japan's battle fleet, they're worth mentioning just the same. All 3 ships were assigned to Admiral Nebogatov's 4th Squadron for the Battle of Tsushima, and as a result, were almost entirely unengaged on the first day of the action. During the night, one of the ships, Admiral Ushikov, was separated from the main group of ships and was later caught and sunk by the Japanese. The other 2 ships surrendered along with the rest of the 4th Squadron to the main Japanese battle fleet, and were subsequently taken as war prizes and pressed into service with the Japanese Navy. The second ship, Admiral Senayevin, okay, I'm just gonna put it on screen because I can't pronounce this shit, was taken and renamed Mishima, while the third and final ship, oh my god, General Admiral Apraxin, was renamed to Okinoshima. Both ships would continue to serve with the Japanese Navy after the battle, with both of them participating in the siege of Tsingtao during the First World War, using their main armament to shell German shore positions and warships inside of the harbor. After the end of World War I, Mishima would go on to take part in Japan's Siberian intervention in the early 1920s, helping to cover Japanese landings, and even acting as an icebreaker to keep sea lanes open. In 1921, the ship was reclassified as a submarine tender and likely had her main armament removed, remaining in service in this role until 1935. After this, she was decommissioned and used as a target for planes from the aircraft carrier Hosho. Okinoshima, for her part, had served with the Japanese Navy up until 1924, spending only 1 year as a submarine tender. Okay, redo this. Okinoshima, for her part, had served with the Japanese Navy up until 1924, spending only 1 year as a submarine tender before being used as a training ship. After her decommissioning in 1925, the ship was sold not to the breakers, but instead to the Battle of the Sea of Japan War Relic Preservation Committee, which planned to turn her into a museum ship, paralleling Mikasa as a surviving Russian ship from Tsushima. However, fate would dictate that this would never happen, as before she could be turned into a museum, Okinoshima ran aground and was subsequently wrecked in a storm. The wreck of the old ship would eventually be scrapped in 1939. A bit of a shame, really. I think we would have all have rather have seen her be preserved. Rest in peace, Okinoshima. You had a good run. Following a bit of a pattern at this point, Tango was also not originally built for the Japanese Navy. She was originally laid down as the Petropavlovsk-class battleship Poltava for the Russian Navy, and saw her first service career commissioned into the Baltic Fleet in 1899. Her deployment to the Baltic was short-lived, however, and the ship would spend most of her career assigned to the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. In hindsight, probably the worst thing that could have possibly happened to her. The start of the Russo-Japanese War saw the ship be on the receiving end of Japan's surprise attack on Port Arthur, where she got into her first tango with the Japanese battleships. During the battle, she was struck several times by Japanese shellfire, although little damage was caused. Following this, she was present when the Russian flagship Petropavlovsk was struck by a mine whilst trying to engage the Japanese outside Port Arthur, resulting in the sinking of the ship and the death of a certain Admiral Makarov, commonly regarded as the biggest blow to morale the Russians would receive during the entire war. Although the incident would prompt the Russians to lay more minefields that would end up sinking both Hatsuse and Yashima a bit later. Poltava would again see combat against the Japanese at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, where she managed to hit Mikasa twice with 12-inch shells, but in turn was crippled by nearly 14 large-caliber shell hits from the Japanese battle line. Limping back to Port Arthur, the ship and her squadron mates were put under siege by the Japanese, eventually culminating in Poltava being sunk by a magazine explosion caused by a Japanese shore battery. Upon the capitulation of Port Arthur in 1905, Poltava would be refloated and commissioned into the Japanese Navy under her new name, Tango. After the war came to a close, Tango continued to serve as part of the Japanese battle fleet, with her service under the Rising Sun culminating in the siege of Tsingtao in 1914, during which she bombarded German shore positions around the harbor. However, this would be her last action under the Japanese flag, as in 1916, weirdly enough, the Japanese sold her back into the Russian Navy. However, this would be her last action under the Japanese flag, as in 1916, the Japanese, weirdly enough, sold her back to the Russian Navy, who by this point were their firm allies. Renamed Chesma, she continued serving with the Russians until 1924, at which point she was decommissioned and sold for scrap. As you could probably guess at this point, the two ships Sagami Class had not originally come from the Japanese Navy. When first constructed, they formed the three ships of the Perezvek class, at the time some of the most modern battleships in, you guessed it, Russia's arsenal. Two of the three ships, Peresvet and Poldeba, were commissioned in 1901, and almost immediately thereafter were deployed to the Russian Pacific Squadron, as you probably guessed, based out of Port Arthur. Although their third sister, Ostilyabaya, remained stationed in the Baltic, the other two ships were thrown into combat only 3 years after arriving on station, with both being engaged during the Battle of Port Arthur in 1904. During the engagement, Peresvet was struck twice below the waterline by Japanese shell fire, although the shells failed to penetrate the armor belt and little damage was done. Her sister Poldeba was hit 3 times during the engagement to similar effect. After the conclusion of the battle, both ships continued to serve during the siege of Port Arthur, witnessing the destruction of the battleship Petropavlovsk and participating in bombardment missions against Japanese shore positions. The two battle fleets would again engage each other at the Battle of the Yellow Sea later that same year, where Peresvet ended up suffering significant damage. After the battleship Cesarevich was struck by 2 12-inch shells from Asahi, the Russian admiral was killed and their battle line thrown into disarray. In an attempt to divert Japanese shellfire, the battleship Retisvan broke formation and charged down the Japanese battle line, and hoped to draw attention away from the stricken flagship. A few minutes later, Peresvet chose to also break formation and follow Retisvan into the charge. Both ships successfully drew Japanese fire away from the rest of the formation, but they suffered heavily for it, with Peresvet taking nearly 39 hits during the battle. Pobeda was a little bit more cautious during the action, and as a result was only hit by around 11 shells, none of which caused serious damage. However, the most severe damage the ships would receive would come during the subsequent siege of Port Arthur. Like most of the other ships of the Pacific Squadron, both Peresvet and Poldeba would end up coming under fierce Japanese gunfire during the siege. Over the course of multiple days, Peresvet was hit over 16 times by large caliber Japanese shells, and was scuttled due to the cumulative damage. Pobeda ended up faring a little bit worse, and during the latter stages of the siege, Japanese siege guns managed to strike Poldeba up to 30 times with 11-inch gunfire, sinking the ship outright into the shallow water, and rendering her incapable of combat. The Russians made attempts to destroy the battleships before the end of the war, but due to her vitals already being submerged, they were unable to manage to do anything other than superficial damage. That applies to both ships. In 1905, the Japanese refloated both of them, and despite the severe damage, both ships managed to get underway under their own power, and steam to the home islands. There, both were commissioned into the Japanese battle fleet, under the respective names Sagami and Suwo. Neither was as of yet quite ready for active service, and both underwent repair and refit until 1908. Suwo served in the peacetime Japanese Navy until 1914, when she saw her first action in 9 years when she served during the siege of Tsingtao during World War I. She served with the British battleship HMS Triumph in bombarding the city's fortifications until the Germans ended up surrendering. After this point, Suwo continued to serve with the Japanese Navy up until 1922, when, in compliance with the Washington Naval Treaty, she was disarmed and sold for scrap, somehow managing to capsize in the process of scrapping. I could not tell you how that managed to happen. Sagami managed to serve even less time with the Japanese, missing all action during the First World War, and incredibly, managing to get herself transferred back into the Russian Navy in 1916. Transferred to the White Sea Fleet and renamed back to Peresvet, she ended up striking 2 mines laid by the German submarine SMU-73 in 1917, and capsized with the loss of 116 men. The ship that would eventually become the Hizen was indeed not laid down under that name. Originally built overseas for the Russian Navy in 1899, she was built in Philadelphia and commissioned into the Russian Navy in 1902, under the name Retisvan. She was a relatively powerful ship, although suffered from the normal design discrepancies of being a Russian design. The ship was present in Russian waters for only a brief period of her career, being assigned to the 1st Russian Pacific Squadron in late 1902. Once the Russo-Japanese War kicked itself off in 1904, Retisvan found herself on the outer edges of Port Arthur, and thus, when the Japanese fleet attacked, she became one of the most heavily engaged ships. Japanese torpedo boats led fierce attacks against the Russian ship, culminating when Retisvan got struck in the bow by a Japanese torpedo, flooding the ship with water and giving her a list of 11 degrees. The ship eventually grounded at the entrance to the harbor after the battle, and although she was temporarily immobilized, she did still manage to fight, helping to prevent Japanese attempts to sink block ships in the harbor entrance. After being refloated and repaired, Retvizan would again sortie with the Russian battle fleet later that year, eventually engaging the Japanese during the Battle of the Yellow Sea. During the action, Retvizan charged down the Japanese battle line in an attempt to direct fire away from the crippled flagship Tsarevich. Although the ploy worked in saving the Russian battleship, Retvizan suffered heavily for it, suffering 18 large-caliber hits during the battle, one of which knocked out her forward turret. The ship returned to Port Arthur after the battle, and like the rest of the Russian Pacific Squadron, ended up being put under siege. The actions around the harbor saw Retvizan struck by many 11-inch rounds from the Japanese howitzer fire, eventually being sunk just before the end of 1904. After the end of the war, the Japanese would raise Retvizan for service in their own navy, steaming her back to Japan under her own power and renaming her to Hizen. Repairs on the ship were effected until 1908, when she formally entered service with the Japanese battle fleet. During the First World War, she was dispatched to Hawaii along with the cruiser Asama in order to keep an eye on the German cruiser SMS Geier. Geier. Oh my god, my pronunciation is not going to work for this video. Just as a side note, I really apologize to all the German, Russian, and Japanese speakers who are watching this, because, I'm not doing a good job. Anyway, this cruiser, oh god, I have to freestyle here. Hizen was dispatched to Hawaii to prevent this cruiser from breaking out. Ah, see, I'm good at this. In the end, the ship was interned by the Americans, and Hizen did not see action. After a brief stint trying to find the German East Asia Squadron, Hizen returned to Japan, seeing out the rest of the war escorting convoys in the Indian Ocean. During the Russian Civil War, the ship was stationed out of Vladivostok, and helped support Japanese landings in Siberia. She was disarmed in 1922 in accordance with the Washington Treaty, and was sunk as a target ship in 1924. Iwami was the most modern battleship the Japanese captured during the Russo-Japanese War. Originally built as the Borodino class battleship Oryo in 1900, the ship was completed in October of 1904, already 8 months into the Russo-Japanese War. Having been stationed in the Baltic upon her commissioning, Oryo was assigned to the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron under Admiral Rozhesvensky, aimed for the goal of sailing around the world and engaging the Japanese battle fleet around Vladivostok. Being basically the newest of the Russian battleships present, Oryo was assigned to the Russian 1st Division, which consisted of every then completed member of the Borodino class. The Russian fleet would end up reaching Japan a year later after setting sail in 1905, and would engage the Japanese in the Tsushima Strait. Due to being in the 1st Division of the Russian battle line, Oryo immediately found herself at the head of the action, and after firing the first shots of the battle at a shadowing Japanese cruiser, she engaged the Japanese battle fleet. The Japanese battleships concentrated their fire at this point against her division mates, quickly sinking the battleship Ostilia Baya and damaging the Russian flagship Knyaz Suvorov. Although targeted by torpedoes from the cruiser Chihaya, Oryo was lightly damaged in the initial action, and remained combat-worthy by nightfall. However, by this point, she was the last remaining battleship of the 1st Division, with Knyaz Suvorov, Imperator Alexander III, and Borodino all having been sunk, meaning that, for the time being, Oryo was the only ship of the Borodino class still afloat, and would remain so until the battleship Slava was commissioned in October of 1905. The next day, Oryo and the rest of the Russian battleships were caught by the Japanese, and along with the other surviving ships, Oryo was forced to surrender to the Japanese. By the time of the battle's end, the ship had taken nearly 73 hits of all calibers and was heavily damaged. Oryo was escorted back to Japan by the battleship Asahi, and on occasion was even towed due to her battle damage. Upon arriving in Japan, the ship was quickly given emergency repairs and commissioned into the Japanese Navy under the new name Iwami. The ship was rebuilt at Kure in 1908, at which point she was formally commissioned and entered service with the Japanese battle fleet. Participating in training maneuvers until the outbreak of World War I, Iwami was assigned to the blockade of Tsingtao in 1914, participating in bombardments of the city until the German surrender. She was used as a guard ship at Kure until the end of World War I, after that point participating in the Siberian intervention, even landing a company of Marines in Vladivostok in 1918. She remained in active service until 1922, until the Washington Naval Treaty necessitated her scrapping. She was disarmed, used as a depot ship, and then sunk as an aircraft target in 1924. Moving back onto battleships originally built for the Japanese Navy, we come to probably the most forgotten of the Japanese pre-dreadnoughts, the Katori Class. These two ships, Katori and Kashima, were built as pretty standard developments to the preceding Mikasa, with their main advantage being the addition of 4 10-inch guns, mounted in a square formation amidships. This intermediate battery sometimes tends to get them referred to as semi-dreadnoughts, akin to the British King Edward class. These were the last proper battleships to be built overseas for Japan, with both ships being laid down in Great Britain in 1904. Neither ship managed to be delivered to the Imperial Navy before the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and as such, they never met the Russians in combat. Despite this, they continued to serve with the Japanese Battlefleet, conducting gunnery drills and sailing on training maneuvers. During one of these training maneuvers, Kashima managed to suffer a magazine explosion in one of her 10-inch guns, starting a fire and killing 34 of her crew members. At the start of the Great War in 1914, Katori sailed with a Japanese squadron that occupied the German colony of Saipan, whilst Kashima did the rather less exciting act of going into refit. In 1918, both Kashima and Katori sailed together to cover Japanese landings in Siberia, after which they returned to Japan. In 1921, the two sisters sailed together again on a goodwill voyage to overseas ports, with Katori carrying a certain Crown Prince Hirohito aboard, the first time any such voyage would ever take place. Both ships were disarmed in 1922 in accordance with the Washington Naval Treaty, and were subsequently scrapped in 1923. Kashima's main gun turrets were removed from the ship and turned over to the Japanese Army, after which point they were installed as coastal artillery around Japan's borders. The rest of her guns were scrapped in 1943. The Satsuma Class is sometimes considered to be the first class of dreadnought battleships commissioned into the Japanese Navy. The two ships, Satsuma and her half-sister Aki, were some of the most powerful battleships in the world upon their conception. They were originally designed as pure dreadnought battleships, with an armament of 10 12-inch guns, with 2 turrets fore and aft, and 6 single turrets mounted parallel to each other on each side amidships. Very possibly the worst main gun arrangement found on any battleship. However, difficulties with sourcing 12-inch guns to arm the ships resulted in all of the single side-mounting guns being switched out to twin 10-inch weapons. However, the Satsumas do still hold the title of being the first ships designed as true dreadnought battleships, although the British ended up being the first to commission a ship of that type. For a myriad of reasons, not least because they were the first battleships laid down in shipyards in the home islands, the construction of the Satsumas was fraught with complications. Although laid down in 1905 and 1906 respectively, construction delays and difficulties in sourcing parts meant that it took until 1911 for both ships to be commissioned into the IJN. The delays were also used to slightly modify the design of the ships a bit, and hopefully improve them before they hit the water. Satsuma was too far along in construction at this point to be changed much, but Aki ended up being modified a bit from her sister. The changes were mostly slight, although the ships did become very visually distinct from each other, since Aki was given a third funnel for some reason. After commissioning in 1910, Satsuma served as a frontline battle unit, participating in fleet exercises and training her crews in gunnery drills. In 1911, she did the not at all unexpected and suffered a turret explosion to one of her 12-inch guns, killing a portion of her crew. That same year, Aki was commissioned into the IJN, and both ships would serve together for the next few years, with Satsuma managing somehow to run into a typhoon. At the start of the First World War, Aki was in refit at Kure, and as such, missed the early stages of the conflict. Satsuma, for her part, was still operational and participated in the seizure of the Palau and Caroline Islands in 1914. Both ships served for the rest of the war quietly, and were decommissioned in 1922 in accordance with the Washington Naval Treaty. Both ships were sunk as targets in 1924. First laid down in 1909, the Kawachi Class were the first dreadnought battleships built for the Japanese Navy. Like the preceding Satsuma Class, they were built in Japanese yards, since Japanese industry had caught up to a point where they could build ships of such a size. In terms of overall design, the Kawachis bore a lot of similarities to the Nassau Class of the Imperial German Navy, the main one being the arrangement of the main gun turrets. Both ships of the Kawachi Class carried their 12-inch guns in a hexagonal turret arrangement, one turret on the bow, one on the stern and 2 on either broadside. This is pretty commonly known as the worst turret arrangement featured on early dreadnoughts, as only 4 of the turrets could fire broadside at any given time. Since the adoption of the battle line meant that battleships were usually only engaged on one side at a time, 2 of Kawachi's turrets would almost always be out of bear during a battle, and would serve to do nothing but take up weight in her design. 2 ships were completed, Kawachi and Setsu, both virtually identical to each other except for the fact that Setsu carried a clipper bow, pretty much the only visual distinction between the 2 of them. Both ships were commissioned into the Japanese Navy in 1912, and were assigned to the Japanese Battlefleet. After Kawachi came into service, in a bit of a morbid foreshadowing, she was present when a sailor aboard Mikasa attempted to blow up his ship by starting a fire in her magazine, a fire that Kawachi assisted in putting out by sending over firefighting crews to the older ship. After the commissioning of Setsu in 1912, the 2 sister ships spent their time together, well, patrolling off of China, something that didn't really end up changing after the start of the First World War. The 2 dreadnoughts participated in the Siege of Tsingtao in 1914, putting their main battery to use bombarding German fortifications until the city's surrender. Both ships were subsequently pulled from the front lines after this point. Not that there really were any front lines anymore, and after that point they were relegated to what was essentially normal peacetime duties, despite Japan still technically being at war. It would remain this way until 1918, when, just a few months before the end of the Great War, Kawachi would see a very sudden end to her career. On the evening of the 11th of July, 1918, Kawachi was sitting at anchor in port when her forward magazine suddenly and violently erupted in a massive explosion. Within 4 minutes, the stricken battleship capsized and sank, taking over 600 lives down with her. A subsequent inquiry into the sinking somehow did not manage to find a single probable cause for why it had happened, and that train of thought was abandoned relatively quickly either way. The IJN briefly considered salvaging Kawachi and returning her to service, but the cost of such an operation would end up significantly delaying further battleship construction, and in the end, her wreck ended up being left mostly in place. Setsu, for her part, continued to serve with the Japanese Navy all the way up until 1922, when the ship was disarmed in accordance with the Washington Naval Treaty. She didn't end up being scrapped, however, but was instead converted to a radio-controlled target ship in 1935, and subsequently saw service in this role for the remainder of her lifetime. She helped to transport Japanese troops during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and was eventually put to use training Japanese carrier pilots for the attack on Pearl Harbor, a role that I think we can safely assume she did a pretty good job at. The ship spent the rest of the Pacific War in the Inland Sea, mostly training carrier pilots for the dwindling Japanese carrier fleet, although, in a similar vein, she did try to mimic the radio traffic of a Japanese carrier fleet to confuse Allied intelligence. For some reason, she was fitted with depth charges in 1944, and was subsequently bombed and sunk by US carriers at Edejima in 1945. Her wreck was subsequently raised in 1946, and scrapped at Kure in 1947. Welcome, everybody, to the first of the battle cruisers present on this list, the Kongo Class. These were fast capital ships, bigger than most battleships, but lightly armored in order to obtain a speed nearly a third higher than any contemporary battleship. The armor was sacrificed for speed, and in that regard, they definitely excelled, as the Kongos were capable of nearly 28 knots, 7 knots faster than any contemporary battleship, and an excellent speed for the detached operations that they were designed for. The Kongo's main armament consisted of 8 new 14-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, and 4 ships would end up being ordered: Kongo, Hiei, Kirishima, and Haruna, all to the exact same design. Due to the sheer size of these ships, being nearly 700 feet long and weighing around 27,000 tons, Japan was forced to order the first ship, Kongo, overseas in Great Britain, as their shipbuilding industry was still figuring out how to build ships of such a massive size. After Kongo was delivered in 1913, the rest of the ships were built in Japanese yards, and all were commissioned by 1915. At the start of the First World War in 1914, Kongo and Hiei were the only ships in commission, and as a result, were the only ones to see service right away, with Kongo helping to defend Japanese sea lanes from German attack, and then sortying with Hiei to support Japanese army units during the Siege of Tsingtao. After Hiei and Kirishima came into service in 1915, all 4 of the Kongos spent the rest of the war patrolling off of China. During the interwar, all of the ships except Hiei survived the Washington Naval Treaty, and all were slowly reconstructed throughout the 1920s. In 1929, the Japanese relabeled the four as fast battleships, arguing that their improved armor protection schemes warranted the redesignation. I will die on the hill that it definitely didn't, and that they were still battlecruisers, but I digress. I'll argue about that later. Hiei, for her part, was still around and kicking, but had been converted into a training ship in order to avoid scrapping, and had most of her armament and some of her armor removed. She spent the rest of the 1930s on training missions and, well, ferrying around the Emperor, something that made her quite popular among the Japanese people. Before the start of the Pacific War in 1937 and 35, all of the Kongos, including Hiei, were sent in for another reconstruction to turn them into fast battleships, suited for escorting the Japanese carrier fleet. All of the ships saw some service during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and after that were put to use escorting the Japanese carrier fleet. On December 7, 1941, Hiei and Kirishima provided close escort for the 6 aircraft carriers that attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, thus beginning the Pacific War. A few days later, both Kongo and Haruna were present when Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse in the Indian Ocean. These two ships then helped to support the Japanese invasions of Malaya and Luzon later that year, whilst Hiei and Kirishima continued to escort the Japanese carriers. The start of 1942 saw the Japanese carrier fleet sortie to the Dutch East Indies, where both Hiei and Kirishima ended up engaging and sinking the destroyer USS Edsel in a surface action. All 4 of the Kongos then joined together with the Japanese carriers for the Indian Ocean raid, where, although they did a good job escorting the carriers, none of them saw any direct combat. During the Battle of Midway later that year, Kirishima and Haruna provided AA fire for the 4 Japanese carriers that attacked the island, something they seem to have done a pretty bad job at, as, well, all 4 of the carriers were sunk. Following this, Kirishima and Hiei participated in the Guadalcanal campaign, when they escorted the Japanese carriers during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, whilst a bit later, Kongo and Haruna joined in by bombarding Henderson Field on Guadalcanal itself. All 4 ships escorted the Japanese carrier fleet during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in late October, before both Hiei and Kirishima began preparations for another attempt to bombard Henderson Field. Spearheading the attack on Guadalcanal in November, both Hiei and Kirishima ended up engaging an American cruiser force during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The action didn't really end up being very coherent, and mostly turned into what is best described as the naval equivalent of a barroom brawl. By the end of the night, multiple Japanese and US ships lay crippled or sunk in the battlefield, including, unfortunately, Hiei. By the coming of dawn, Hiei came under concentrated air attack from both Henderson Field and the carrier USS Enterprise, eventually succumbing to the damage and capsizing, becoming the first Japanese battleship sunk during the Second World War. Kirishima would attempt another engagement the next night, where she was again confronted by a US battle force. The Japanese ended up being engaged by the US battleships Washington and South Dakota in the first battleship fight of the Pacific War. During the action, South Dakota was heavily targeted by the Japanese, and Kirishima's 14-inch guns managed to cripple the battleship. However, this focus on South Dakota allowed Washington to get the jump on Kirishima, and the old battlecruiser was struck nearly 20 times by US 16-inch gunfire. Kirishima couldn't be saved, and foundered later that night. The remaining 2 Kongos spent the rest of 1942 and 1943 flitting between Japanese naval bases, and attempting to help the Japanese carrier fleet engage the US. Nothing ended up coming from it, and Kongo and Haruna would only see their next action in early 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Since this engagement was entirely a carrier battle, the Kongos saw no action outside of anti-aircraft escort, although Haruna was struck by 2 500-pound bombs from the US carriers. Later that same year, the 2 battleships were assigned to Admiral Kurita's center force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the last major combat action of the Japanese fleet. Both Kongo and Haruna survived US air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea on October 22nd, and then ended up engaging a fleet of US escort carriers the next day during the Battle off Samar. During the action, Kongo managed to break off from the main Japanese battle fleet, and pursued an independent course for the entirety of the action, something that ended up playing into her favor, as she managed to sink the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts with 14-inch gunfire, and damage the destroyer USS Heermann. Haruna stayed with the main Japanese battle line, and although she managed to hit the escort carrier Gambier Bay with a 14-inch shell, she didn't do much else. Although the surface action itself was incredibly one-sided, US air strength during the battle forced the Japanese to retire from the action without having caused a whole lot of damage. The remnants of the Japanese Navy subsequently tried to retreat from the Philippines back to Japan, subsequently during which Kongo was sunk by the submarine USS Sea Lion on the 21st of November, leaving Haruna as the Kongo class's sole survivor. By 1945, the Japanese Navy was no longer capable of challenging the US in direct action, and Haruna was eventually sunk in Kure Harbor by US aircraft on the 28th of July, less than a month before the end of the war. Her wreck remained in place until 1946, when the stricken battlecruiser was raised and sold for scrap, ending a very long and storied career. Also, shameless plug, but I have a video on Konnichiwa out on my channel right now. I think it's pretty good, so, you know, if you think that's something you like to see, then, well, yeah, go check it out. Okay, back to some proper battleships now. We come to the Fuso Class. Definitely not to be confused with the earlier ironclad of the same name, this was a class of 2 battleships ordered and built during the First World War. The 2 ships, Fuso and her sister Yamashiro, were built in the same era as the Kongo Class, although since they were battleships, they were equipped with a much higher level of armor and armament. The Fusos carried a main battery of no less than 12 14-inch guns, one of the highest numbers ever carried on a battleship. The arrangement of the guns meant that the Fusos carried an overtly high number of magazines below decks, significantly increasing the chance of the ship getting randomly blown up by a shell hit. At the time of the first ship's commissioning in 1915, the 2 Fuso sisters were arguably the most powerful battleships in the world, really only matched by the British Queen Elizabeth class. 2 ships were built, Fuso and Yamashiro, and both entered service with the Imperial Navy during the First World War, Yamashiro to a slightly different design. During World War I, both ships entered service long after the Central Powers had lost their hold on Asia, and as a result, neither saw any combat during the war. After a brief stint patrolling off of China in 1918, the war ended and the 2 ships were reduced to peacetime duties. During the 1920s, both of the ships spent time, well, patrolling off of China, and Yamashiro became the first Japanese battleship to launch an aircraft, when a Gloucester Sparrowhawk took off from a flying-off platform on her No. 2 turret. Both ships survived the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, and were subsequently used to aid survivors of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. At the start of the 1930s, both ships went into refit at Yokosuka, receiving upgrades to their torpedo protection and machinery spaces, along with having their superstructures rebuilt into pagoda masts. For the rest of the 1930s, the ships spent their time on the standard training missions and, you guessed it, patrolling off of China. At the start of the Pacific War in 1941, the 2 battleships sortied with the aircraft carrier Hosho to provide cover for the Japanese carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor. Both ships subsequently sortied again as distant support for Operation AL in June of 1942, and as a result, missed the Battle of Midway. The old ships subsequently returned to Japanese home waters, at which point proposals were put forward to convert the old ships into hybrid aircraft carriers, citing the need to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway. This never ended up coming to anything, as it was, well, really a stupid idea, and the ships resumed their normal duties. Around this time, Yamashiro was reduced to a training ship, as she was judged to be rather obsolete at this point. Fuso stuck around a little bit longer, and narrowly avoided being caught by US carrier aircraft during Operation Hailstone in 1944. During the US invasion of Saipan later that year, somebody in the Japanese Admiralty came up with a plan to use Yamashiro to stop the US invasion. It reads about as badly as you would expect it to. Yamashiro was supposed to steam down to Saipan, avoid the swarms of US carrier aircraft that would probably harass her on the way there, and then beach herself on the island to be used as a floating battery. This was a stupid idea, but to absolutely nobody's surprise, it ended up being approved, and was designated Operation Y-Go. However, rather fortunately for Yamashiro, the operation was cancelled after Japan's disastrous defeat during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In early August and July, both of the ships were refitted at Kure before being assigned to Battleship Division 2 and being relocated to Brunei Bay. In October of 1944, the 2 ships sortied as part of the Japanese Southern Force for Operation Shogo, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Under the command of Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, the 2 battleships were accompanied by the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers in an attempt to raid the US landing beaches on the island of Leyte. On the 24th of October, Nishimura's ships were attacked in the Sulu Sea by aircraft from the US carriers Franklin and Enterprise. Fuso was struck by 2 bombs during the attack, one of which set off her load of depth charges and gave her a list of 2 degrees, although this was soon corrected. Yamashiro wasn't struck directly during the attack, but near misses flooded her starboard torpedo bulge, and gave her a list, somehow, of nearly 15 degrees, although this was also quickly corrected. On the morning of the 25th, Fuso made contact with what she believed to be an enemy ship and opened fire. Her target actually turned out to be Mogami, and a ceasefire was soon ordered. Later that night, Nishimura's force entered the Surigao Strait, their last step before the Leyte landing beaches. Reconnaissance efforts the previous night had proved the presence of at least 3 US battleships blocking the strait's exit, and the Japanese prepared to engage. In the early stages of the Battle of the Surigao Strait, the Japanese battleships came under attack from US PT boats, which tried to stop them with a torpedo attack. These attacks failed to do any appreciable damage, and PT-493 was hit and eventually sunk by Yamashiro's secondary battery. A few hours later, the Japanese again suffered a torpedo attack, this time by US destroyers. Fuso opened main battery fire on her attackers, but it came too late. Fuso was struck on the starboard side by 3 torpedoes, and then by one amidships on her port side, forcing her forward magazine spaces to be flooded and slowing her speed to a crawl. Fuso fell out of formation astern of Yamashiro and had her place taken up by Mogami as the battleship dropped behind. Fuso had slowed to only around 6 knots, but damage control efforts managed to get the ship's speed back up after a few minutes. Yamashiro had also been struck by 2 torpedoes, but she managed to continue on, oblivious to what had happened to her sister. By around 3:40, Fuso had managed to get her speed back up and was continuing forward around 10,000 yards behind Yamashiro. At this point, Fuso's radar detected large contacts ahead of her at a range of 30,000 yards, the US battle line. The 6 US battleships and 8 cruisers that were blocking the exit to the strait had also detected Fuso at 30,000 yards, as well as Yamashiro around 20,000 yards ahead, but were under orders not to open fire until Fuso came within 20,000 yards of their battle line. Fuso was under no such orders, and immediately turned to unmask her aftermost guns in an attempt to engage the US battle line. Unfortunately for her, just as her 14-inch guns were turning to engage, she was struck on her port side by 3 more torpedoes. The damage proved to be too much for the old battleship, and she quickly capsized and sank, with all but 10 of her crew being killed due to the oil fires. With Fuso's radar contact now disappearing from their charts, the US battle line were given orders to open fire on their remaining contacts. At a range of 22,400 yards, USS West Virginia was the first battleship to fire, targeting Yamashiro with her 16-inch guns. The Japanese battleship was immediately struck by a 16-inch shell to the base of her pagoda mast, and quickly began returning fire with her forward armament. Minutes later, USS Tennessee and California also began firing, followed by the 8 cruisers. The remaining Japanese ships were being swarmed by US cruisers at the same time, and many of the US battleships were having difficulties determining which radar contacts were hostile, meaning that many of them failed to fire. Yamashiro came under concentrated fire from a large portion of the US formation, and was quickly observed to be burning with severe topside damage. Yamashiro continued switching targets with her main battery for most of this time, targeting the US battle line only once with a 4-gun salvo, which straddled the destroyer USS Claxton. In the meantime, her secondary battery engaged the US destroyers plaguing Mogami, striking USS Albert W. Grant around 7 times with 6-inch shell fire, and straddling the cruiser Denver with her main battery. At this point, the Japanese ships had taken so much damage that Nishimura ordered a retreat. Yamashiro swung around to port, unleashing a single salvo from her midships turrets, and then beating a hasty retreat. She had been targeted for only around 7 minutes, and although she had been struck by yet another torpedo, she was still capable of around 15 knots. The US battle line had ceased fire at this point, with reports of friendly fire coming in from all over the fleet, and Yamashiro was nearly given a clean escape. However, this was not meant to be, and 2 more torpedoes struck her starboard engine room. With her speed cut to all but nothing, the battleship listed 45 degrees and capsized and sank stern first. In a morbid coincidence, only 10 men survived her sinking, the same as her sister Fuso. There can be no doubt in my mind that such an epic last stand by a battleship has rarely ever been demonstrated as well as it was by IJN Yamashiro. The Ise Class was pretty much just a standard improvement over the Fuso Class. The main difference between the two of them was the Ise's having their midships turrets clumped together into a super firing arrangement, allowing for a more compact dispersion of the magazine spaces. Aside from this, the main armament remained exactly the same, and the only other differences were some slight armor improvements over the Fuso Class, although I will say, something about their profile looks distinctly better than their predecessors. I don't know, maybe the ship bucket artwork is just really good. Shout out to all the people who made the artwork used in this video, by the way. They're all credited in the description. Two ships were ordered for the Ise Class, named Ise and Hyuga respectively. Much like the preceding Fusos, neither managed to enter service in time to see action during the Great War, and instead were relegated to the standard duties of training and, well, patrolling off of China. One of these exercises that they took part in 1919 saw Hyuga suffer an explosion to one of her 14-inch guns, killing 11 of her crewmen and forcing the ship into port for repairs. No sooner had she got out than she collided with the schooner Hiromiya Maru, sinking the smaller ship. In case you can't already tell, Hyuga was starting to develop the look of a rather clumsy ship. Ise, being the older, and I guess more level-headed sister if you want to look at it that way, didn't get herself into nearly as much trouble, and ended up participating in multiple patrols off the Siberian coast in 1920, accompanied of course by her sister. Once 1923 came around, both ships helped aid the survivors of the Great Kanto earthquake, and resumed training once this was finished. The rest of the 1920s saw both ships, well, patrolling off of China, and both went into refit at the start of the 1930s. The changes made to the ships were much the same as those that occurred on other Japanese battleships, and both came out looking much the same besides for their new pagoda masts. To be fair, this was a big change, but despite the big visual difference, neither ship saw much change in terms of their lifestyle. Hyuga managed to get herself into trouble when she nearly collided with the submarine I-4 in 1932. In the mid-1930s, both ships were dry docked again for another refit, this time lasting until 1937. Both ships then helped ferry troops to China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, including one visit that Hyuga made to, oh hey, would you look at that, Port Arthur. What a coincidence. Both ships would sortie for the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, reinforcing the supporting division led by the light carrier Hosho. Both ships would subsequently return to Japan, and would make an attempt to catch the US carriers that had launched the Doolittle raid in 1942, although no contact was made. Around this time, Ise was also fitted with an early Type 21 radar set, although it ended up being removed pretty shortly after. Despite technically being at war, neither of the two ships had much to do yet, and they resumed the standard training and gunnery drills that were now so familiar to them. Ise didn't seem to have much of a problem with any of these, but Hyuga, living up to her unfortunate reputation, managed to suffer an explosion to one of her 14-inch guns. The detonation wrecked her No. 5 turret, and nearly managed to detonate her magazine. The ship returned to port, where the damage was deemed to be irreparable, and the turret was removed and plated over, with multiple 25mm AA guns being installed in its place. Ise and Hyuga both sortied as support for the invasion of the Aleutian Islands in early June, and as such, missed the Battle of Midway altogether. It wasn't like the battle didn't end up affecting the two sisters anyway. The loss of 4 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway meant that a stopgap measure needed to be implemented quickly. As previously mentioned, some plans were put forward to convert the 2 Fuso Class battleships into battle carriers, and although that particular plan didn't end up going through, it sorta just ended up being slapped onto the Ise Class instead. Ise and Hyuga went into dock in 1943 to begin their reconstruction, only coming out in early 1944. The two ships had their aft guns removed, and a flight deck and hangar installed in their place, giving the ships the ability to operate around 22 aircraft via catapult. Despite technically now being half aircraft carriers, the two ships missed the Battle of the Philippine Sea due to the need to train their flight crews, and were only assigned to the Japanese carrier fleet a few months later. This saw them commissioned just in time to participate in Operation Shogo, better known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Sortying as part of the decoy Japanese carrier force meant to lure away the Americans, neither Ise nor Hyuga were carrying any aircraft at the time of the battle. The 4 actual Japanese carriers that were present launched only a single strike against the US before being set upon by aircraft from nearly 16 US carriers. Both ships engaged the US aircraft with their 14-inch guns to little effect, and in return were targeted only mildly. Hyuga wasn't hit particularly hard during the attacks, but near misses flooded one of her torpedo bulges and gave her a list of 5 degrees to port, which was quickly corrected. In return, she claimed to shoot down 5 US aircraft. Ise was targeted a lot more than her sister, but her helmsman gave an excellent account of herself by dodging nearly every bomb that came for his ship, and suffering 8 near misses in the process. Both Ise and Hyuga retreated with the rest of the surviving Japanese ships after the battle, making the perilous journey back to Japan in early 1945. Along the way, they were set upon multiple times by US submarines, but some good luck combined with counter-battery fire from Hyuga managed to see them make it back to Japan unharmed. Both battle carriers ended their life in the most common way seen by the Japanese Navy, bombed and sunk by US aircraft in Kure Harbor. Ise put up a good fight, but settled to the bottom of the harbor on the 28th of July, and Hyuga would follow shortly after, being sent to her grave as the last Japanese battleship sunk during the war. Ironically, despite all of her accidents and mishaps, Hyuga ended up being the longer-lived of the two ships. Both of their wrecks were raised and scrapped post-war in 1947. Nobody can really deny that both Ise and Fuso were good ships for their time, but inevitably, they had to be superseded by an even more powerful design. During the First World War, the British Royal Navy had worked extensively on upgrading the sizes of their battleships' guns, eventually working all the way up to the 18-inch guns mounted on HMS Furious. The rest of the world obviously took notice of these developments, and eventually everybody began working on designs for ships armed with even larger guns. Being one of the leading naval powers, Japan was obviously included in this, and they began working on designing a ship armed with 16-inch guns, a process that would eventually result in the Nagato Class. These ships marked a pretty large departure from previous Japanese battleship design, as whilst Ise and Fuso were armed with 12 14-inch guns, the Nagatos cut down the amount of guns to only 8, and increased the caliber to the much more potent 16 inches. Due to the sheer amount of power that could be brought to bear by these weapons, the Nagatos immediately became the most powerful battleships in the world at the time of their completion. 2 ships would end up being built, Nagato in 1920 and her sister Mutsu in 1921. Due to their extreme size and power, the construction and even commissioning of the ships was fraught with complications. The funds to build Mutsu had to be raised by collecting donations from Japanese schoolchildren, and as if this wasn't already bad enough, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 tried to force Japan to scrap Mutsu anyway. Japan managed to get around this by taking the much older battleship Setsu out of active service, but it was a close call nonetheless. After entering service, both ships would quickly cease service, helping survivors of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, before going to the standard peacetime practices of the Japanese Battlefleet. In 1924, both Nagato and Mutsu used the old battleship Satsuma as target practice in the inland sea, before being transferred to reserve. Both ships would undergo a major reconstruction in 1934, largely improving the ships and changing their visual appearance quite drastically by trunking their 2 funnels. After coming out of refit in 1936, Nagato got herself tangled in the midst of an attempted coup by some members of the Japanese army. With the situation escalating to the point that Nagato was forced to land some of her sailors in Tokyo Bay to fight the uprising. After Mutsu got out of refit, both ships would spend some time transporting Japanese troops to China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, before being placed in use as training ships. That doesn't make sense. After Mutsu got out of refit, both ships would spend some time transporting Japanese troops to China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, before being placed in use as training ships. That didn't really last that long though, and to be honest, it never would, as both ships would be out about again shortly after. Nagato and Mutsu would sortie with the Japanese carrier Hosho during the attack on Pearl Harbor, with Nagato being the ship that sent the signal "Climb Mountain Itaka" that initiated the attack. Neither ship ended up seeing direct action though, and they both returned to Japan. Both sortied out for the Battle of Midway in May of 1942, although like most other Japanese battleships, acted in only a supporting role. Despite attempts to engage the Americans after the Japanese carriers had gotten their asses handed to them, neither of the ships saw combat and both returned back to Japan. After the US invaded Guadalcanal later that year, Mutsu was dispatched to the Japanese naval base at Truk Lagoon, where she prepared to engage the Americans. After a failed attempt to locate the escort carrier USS Long Island, Mutsu sortied with the Japanese carrier fleet during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, acting as the main element of the forward guard force to the Japanese carriers. Mildly unfortunately for Mutsu, this group remained unengaged for the entire battle, and Mutsu's only contribution was firing a single 16-inch salvo against US recon aircraft that had spotted her force. She didn't hit anything and returned to truck after the battle. However, this would not be where her misfortunes ended. Actually, far from it. The day was the 8th of June 1943 when Mutsu suddenly and violently exploded in her Ashijima anchorage. The ship split in two around the area of the stern and began sinking rapidly. The nearby battleship Fuso dropped lifeboats in an attempt to rescue Mutsu's survivors, and although she was successful in that regard, there was no saving the sinking battleship. Mutsu sank to the bottom of the harbor with the loss of 1,121 sailors. Nobody is really even sure to this day what actually caused the ship to explode, although the leading theory is that a suicidal crew member deliberately blew up Mutsu's magazine as a form of suicide, kinda like what happened with USS Iowa. With her sister now dead, Nagato continued to serve with the Japanese Battlefleet, meeting the Americans in combat again during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, where she provided AA escort for the Japanese carrier Junyo. She apparently did a relatively good job of this, only on the premise that Junyo didn't end up being sunk during the attacks, with Nagato claiming 2 kills on enemy aircraft. After the US attacks had ended, Nagato attempted to take Junyo's sister ship Hio in tow, but subsequently failed and was forced to leave the carrier to her fate. Despite suffering a horrible defeat during the battle, Nagato would get another chance to engage the Americans not long after, this time as part of Operation Shogo, better known, of course, as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Nagato was assigned to the Japanese center force during the action, and attempted to penetrate to the Leyte landing beaches via the San Bernardino Strait. Even making it to the strait itself turned out to be kinda difficult, however, and Nagato was set upon by US carrier aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea. She was struck by 2 bombs during the attack, and suffered only mild damage from them. The center force managed to exit the San Bernardino Strait the next day, where they pretty quickly ran their way into a small group of US escort carriers called Taffy 3. In what is undeniably one of the most famous, misunderstood, confusing, and heroic actions of the entire Pacific War, the Japanese battle fleet threw themselves against a formation of ships that had no business engaging them in a service fight. To say that Nagato acquitted herself well during the action would be a blunt lie. During the initial stages of the action, she targeted the escort carrier USS White Plains with her main battery, but was quickly forced to shift targets due to the smoke screens and a particularly brave trio of US destroyers. She may have hit the escort carrier Kalinin Bay with a 16-inch shell during the action, although this hit is heavily contested between her and Haruna, so nobody can really decide what actually happened there. Nagato ended up retreating from the action after doing almost nothing, and subsequently returned to Japan. Here, unlike most Japanese battleships, she was docked in Yokosuka instead of Kure, and was deployed as a floating anti-aircraft battery. Lying not that far away from where Mikasa was sitting as a museum ship, Nagato was attacked only once by US carrier aircraft, and suffered mild damage because of it. Due to the US focusing most of their attention on bombing Kure, Nagato remained untouched after this action, and ended the war as the only remaining Japanese battleship still afloat. Even more impressive considering that she was the one the US had most wanted to see dead. At the end of the war, the US took Nagato as a war prize, and almost immediately decided that they had to get rid of her. Every US commander was frankly pissed that the Japanese battleship that had sent the signal to begin the attack on Pearl Harbor had ended up being the only one that survived, and they were going to dispose of her one way or another. Nagato was pretty quickly slated for Operation Crossroads, and was subsequently steamed out to Bikini Atoll under a skeleton crew. As the main part of the test, the ship was nuked twice. The US deliberately positioned her as one of the closest ships to the explosions, probably hoping that she would be one of the first to sink. Annoyingly, the first blast left her afloat, and the US even managed to run one of her boilers for 36 minutes without any apparent problems. A bit pissed off by this, she stayed in pretty much the exact same spot for the second explosion a few days later. This time, the atomic blast caused a tsunami to emanate from the explosion, a tsunami that Nagato annoyingly ended up riding out pretty much intact. She had sprung a bit of a leak, however, and since she was heavily radioactive at this point, nobody wanted to touch her, and she was left to bleed to death where she was, finally capsizing on the 30th of July, 1946. The Tosa Class was more or less designed as a general upgrade and improvement over the preceding Nagatos. The ships were designed based around a proposed alternate design for IJN Mutsu, made before the ship had finished construction, and eventually turned into what would eventually become the design for the Tosa Class. These ships were both larger and more heavily armed than the Nagatos, featuring 2 added 16-inch guns and a turret placed amidships, in addition to some general armor and secondary battery improvements over the Nagatos. The Japanese would order 2 ships, Tosa, built at Nagasaki, and the second ship, Kaga, from Kobe. Both ships began construction in 1920, and after that point, it all continued relatively well. Kaga actually managed to launch earlier than Tosa in November of 1921, whilst Tosa followed a little bit later in December. However, unfortunately, this is where all semblance of a smooth building process basically went to shit. All over the world, many leading and even secondary naval powers were beginning to propose a suspension of capital ship construction, and since Japan fell into the latter category of a leading naval power, they were forced to get involved as well. All of this would result in the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, a treaty that did exactly what it was intended to do and placed a ban on all further capital ship construction. Since Japan had signed it to keep on good relations with the rest of the world, all of their capital ships currently being constructed had to be disposed of, including the 2 ships of the Tosa Class. By this point in time, both of the ships had progressed far enough along into construction to be able to float, and Tosa was even capable of providing her own heating power, although she still couldn't move. As the Washington Naval Treaty came into effect, there was pretty much no viable option for completing the 2 battleships, and both were slated for disposal in one way or another. Kaga ended up being assigned to the scrapyard, whilst Tosa's hull was given the honor of operating as a target ship. Nearly 50,000 people turned out to watch Tosa be towed into Kure Harbor, looking a bit sad with only her bridge wings and a small funnel being installed on her deck. She languished in port for a while after this point, until eventually in 1924 she was turned over to the Japanese Navy Gunnery School and was prepared for testing. The hulk of the battleship was towed out to sea and immediately subjected to a myriad of tests against the ship's protection. 3 torpedoes and 4 mines were detonated against Tosa's hull to test her ability to withstand torpedo hits. She proved capable of withstanding a torpedo with a 440-pound warhead, but pretty much no higher. Tests were also conducted on her internal structure, with large explosives being placed inside some of the ship's main weak points, such as her torpedo magazines. However, far and away the most important test conducted against the battleship ended up being one of the smallest. One of the Japanese 16-inch guns, the same that the Tosa would have been equipped with had she been completed, were fired against the battleship from long range. Whoever aimed the gun probably could have done a better job of it, as the shell came up short of Tosa's hull and slammed into the water. However, in a bit of a shocking turn of events, the shell dived into the water and struck Tosa 11 feet below the waterline, flooding the ship's hull and increasing her list by 4 degrees. The effect this shell had was a bit scary to the Japanese, as the power of the shell diving underwater had quickly been made apparent to them. The IJN would quickly respond to this, designing their new warships with an armored belt extending below the waterline, and even modifying their own shells to be able to dive underwater so as to wreak the same kind of damage to the enemy. After the tests were conducted, Tosa's thoroughly mangled hulk was towed back into port, where it remained until 1925, when the ship was finally ordered to be properly disposed of. The now decommissioned battleship Setsu towed Tosa out to a point around Okinoshima Island, and her Kingston valves were opened, sinking Tosa to the bottom. Interestingly enough, her sister Kaga would end up having something more of an active career. Although originally slated for scrapping, some technical difficulties and an earthquake ended up resulting in Kaga being converted to an aircraft carrier. That doesn't make any sense right now, but I'll explain it in a bit. Kaga would be commissioned as an aircraft carrier in 1928, and would continue serving with the IJN up until 1942, when she was sunk by aircraft from USS Enterprise at the Battle of Midway. The Amagi Class were essentially designed as a sort of replacement design for the preceding Kongo Class. They weren't properly battleships, but instead were battlecruisers, given this distinction for their design top speed of 30 knots. However, even so, they were incredibly powerful ships, being armed with the same 10 16-inch guns as the contemporary Tosa Class, and even featured relatively similar levels of armor protection. After their design was finalized, 4 ships would end up being ordered: Amagi, Akagi, Atago, and Takao, the same number as the Kongos. However, as was pretty standard for capital ship construction around this time, the Washington Naval Treaty ended up intervening with their construction. Like the 2 ships of the Tosa Class, Japan's signature on the treaty ended up necessitating that all 4 ships be disposed of in one way or another. At this point in time, both Amagi and Akagi were already very far along in construction, with both of their hulls being nearly completed, and as a result, Japan decided that they would utilize a clause in the treaty that allowed them to convert 2 of their capital ships into aircraft carriers. Due to their high top speed and sleek hull form, the Amagis were pretty much their best bet for the conversion, and Amagi and Akagi would end up being chosen. However, as it often does, well, actually not really, but that sounded cool, nature ended up intervening. In 1923, Japan was struck by the Great Kanto earthquake, and unfortunately for the IJN, Amagi was caught in the center of it. The earthquake heavily damaged the ship on the slipway, and by the time it was over, Amagi was too far damaged to be worth the effort of conversion. However, it could have been a lot worse, and Akagi came out of the earthquake relatively fine, so she finished conversion pretty steadily. To replace Amagi, the Tosa Class battleship Kaga was slated for conversion instead. See, I told you it would make sense. Akagi was commissioned into the IJN in 1927, and after that point, continued serving on the front lines. She served as a flagship of the Japanese carrier fleet for most of her career, finally being sunk in 1942 at the Battle of Midway. The Kii Class was essentially just an improvement over the preceding Amagis, and at that, it wasn't exactly much of one. The argument over whether these ships were battleships or battlecruisers can be basically never-ending, since their improvements over the Amagis were so slight. The Kiis maintained almost exactly the same armament as their predecessors, and their main difference was simply an increased armor belt and a reduced speed, something that does make them lean a little bit closer to being a fast battleship rather than a battlecruiser. Regardless of this confusion, the Japanese would order 4 of these ships, Kii, Owari, and 2 that went unnamed, being designated simply numbers 11 and 12. None of the ships were anywhere near being even launched by the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, and like their predecessors, all of the Kiis were cancelled and scrapped soon after. Oh boy, now we come to the number 13 class. These are some of the ships that we know the least about, pretty purely for the reason that they existed for such a short period of time that there isn't much to say about them. These were 4 fast battleships, ordered as the successors to the Kii Class, successors that improved upon them in a very big way. Unlike any battleship previously designed for Japan, the number 13s were armed with 18-inch guns, 8 of them to be specific, dropping the middle turret in order to keep the ships within their designated size limit. Their hulls and armor scheme were essentially just made a bit larger and more advanced than the Kiis in order to deal with the extra firepower on the ships, but even so, they were still capable of nearly 30 knots. Had these ships been completed, they would have been undoubtedly the most powerful class of battleship in all of existence, rivaling any warship that could be found in anyone's navy. 4 ships were ordered, number 13, number 14, number 15, and, you guessed it, number 16. By 1922, none of the ships had yet begun construction, and had so far only managed to get themselves assigned to specific yards. As you could probably guess at this point, the Washington Naval Treaty ended up intervening in their construction, and none of the ships were ever laid down. All were cancelled in 1923. However, they do still live on to this day as the ships in the Bungo line, my personal favorite battleship line in World of Warships. Oh, okay, yeah, I know. There's probably like a million of you behind your screens right now dashing to the comment section to write a furious comment being like, "Oh, but these aren't battleships. They're not even battlecruisers. Instant like and unsub, you suck." Well, first of all, these are battlecruisers, or at least I think they are. Feel free to prove me wrong. And second of all, well, you suck too. Either way, on a serious note, there is a lot of argument about what these ships should be called. Some, like me, will die on the hill that they are battlecruisers, whilst others will adamantly swear by them being large cruisers, whatever the hell that means. Personally, I've been in enough arguments about this for a lifetime, and I've only been on r/World of Warships for 2 years. That's how bad it is. Personally, I think everybody's already so divided on this topic that all I have to do is to post this video and algorithm farm due to all the arguments that will spawn in the comments. I myself am going to try and exercise willpower and not get involved in any of them, although it can be very difficult to resist a good argument. Anyway, the B-65s were a class of battlecruisers designed for the Japanese Navy in the late 1930s. The ships had a pretty confusing list of specifications, being a similar length and size to the Kongo Class, and carrying a main battery of 9 12.2-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 2 fore and 1 aft, with sufficient armor to withstand 8-inch gunfire, and a top speed of 33 knots. After the finalization of their design, 4 ships would end up being ordered, none of which were given names. After an attempt to increase their armament to 6 14-inch guns was tossed out of the window, the 2 ships would be ordered. However, by 1941, the Pacific War was beginning to loom over Japan, and priorities began to shift to smaller auxiliary vessels and aircraft carriers. By the time the war actually began, this plan was cemented even further, and the loss of 4 carriers at the Battle of Midway in 1942 all but sealed the deal on Japanese priorities. 2 ships were still planned to be completed, with projected completion dates of 1944 and 1946 respectively. However, the war continued to progress, and as Japanese shipbuilding efforts were struggling to continue keeping up with their expected wartime production, the B-65s no longer had a place. None were ordered, and both ships that were actually planned to be built were cancelled before the war's end. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for. More than likely, the reason that you clicked on this video. The pride of the Imperial Navy and the largest battleship ever to be built in all of history. You know these ships as well as I do. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the Yamato Class. Oh wow, where even to begin with these? There's too much to say about them to put it all into just one short segment. Their service careers, their design process, the myths and misconceptions surrounding these ships. There's just far too much, and I can't do them justice in this video. Probably not even 100 videos. However, contractually, I'm obligated to at least try. The Yamato Class was an incredibly large departure from previous Japanese battleship design, probably more so than any other ship on this list. Their predecessors like the Nagato, Tosa, Amagi, and Kii classes were obviously good ships of their time, but in terms of foreign design, they weren't really anything special. However, this trend of trying to individually match foreign designs with their capital ships was all but killed in the mid-1930s when the Yamato class began to enter the drawing board. The concept behind these ships was actually relatively simple. The Japanese were going to take advantage of the treaty system that they so despised, and use what had previously restricted themselves against their enemy. After the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, all capital ship construction had been almost completely suspended for all signatory countries, essentially meaning that aside from a few pretty restricted and cut down designs, no further battleships or battlecruisers were going to enter the water until the treaty system was either suspended itself or had collapsed. The Japanese, however, realized that this actually gave them a really big advantage if they played dirty. The Japanese realized that if they abandoned the treaty system in its entirety and constructed a monstrously big capital ship in complete secret, by the time this ship entered the water, there would be no ship in the world that had yet been built to challenge it, and Japan would gain de facto naval supremacy in the Pacific. This plan was readily accepted, and the Japanese quickly began putting their design teams to work to create a class of ships that would fulfill all of these requirements, free of all treaty restrictions. Through 1934 and 1936, nearly 21 initial designs were proposed for the massive battleship. Only 4 of these were maintained as possibilities, and in the end, the final design of the ship would only be accepted in 1937, the design that was to become the Yamato Class. These ships were massive, being twice as large as any other capital ship in the world at the time. At full load, the ships would weigh nearly 70,000 tons, and would be armed with a staggering total of 9 18.1-inch guns as their main armament. Backing these up would be a total of 12 6-inch guns and 12 5-inch guns as their secondary battery, giving these ships a secondary firepower advantage roughly equal to that of a light cruiser. Their armor didn't discriminate either, with nearly every critical component of the ships being armed well enough to withstand US 16-inch gunfire from nearly any range other than point blank. This was completely intentional. The ships of the Yamato class were designed for no other purpose than to counter 2 of the US 16-inch armed Colorado class at the same time, meaning that in battle line formation, the Yamatos were expected to split their fire between 2 US dreadnoughts and win the fight with minimal damage all by themselves. The Japanese originally planned to build no less than 5 of these behemoths, with the first being ordered and laid down in 1937. Her name would be Yamato, named after the ancient Japanese province and the proverbial name for Japan itself, the pinnacle of Japanese battleship construction and the pride of the entire country. 5 ships were ordered: Yamato, Musashi, Shinano, and 2 more that were never named, numbers 111 and 797. In the end, the latter was never laid down, and only the first 4 ships ever began construction. All were built in great secrecy, with great fabric curtains being erected on the slipways, and all camera equipment being strictly banned from the vicinity of the shipyards. Secrecy was so strict that no construction workers working on the ships were allowed to even mention their existence, and civilians living around the yards were told to avoid looking in the direction of the slipways, and for all windows facing the docks to be closed and shuttered at all times. The Japanese were so adamant about this secrecy that a shortage of fishing wire was actually caused from Musashi's construction, as the Japanese Navy had purchased near enough tons of it to suspend the curtains surrounding the battleship's slipway. Under conditions of great secrecy, Yamato would be launched to little fanfare in August of 1940, with Musashi's launch taking place in the dead of night a few months later in November. Yamato's fitting out process would continue steadily after this point, with the massive battleship finally being completed in October of 1941. Proceeding steadily from this point, Yamato would undergo sea and gunnery trials up until the 16th of December 1941, at which point she was deemed to be operational and was formally commissioned into the Japanese Navy as the flagship of the Japanese battle line and the head of the 1st Battleship Division. By this point, the attack on Pearl Harbor had long since concluded, and war with the United States had started only around a week earlier. Although technically being commissioned and operational, Yamato immediately found herself in a position seen by nearly all battleships completed during wartime. She was operational, but not completely combat capable. The next few months were spent on training her crew for battle, and operating as the flagship of Admiral Yamamoto, a task that necessitated staying mostly close to the home islands. After nearly getting sideswiped by the aircraft carrier Junyo on a training mission, Yamato was finally deemed operational on the 27th of May 1942. This date was no coincidence. The Japanese had planned for Yamato to become operational just in time to form the head of Yamamoto's main battle group at the Battle of Midway. Yamato sailed as the flagship of the Japanese battle fleet, accompanying Nagato and Mutsu as the rear guard of the Japanese carrier fleet that attacked Midway Atoll. This went pretty much fine for the battleships. They were stationed so far behind the carriers that none saw any action during the main stage of the battle, and in the end, Yamato's only contribution was, well, acting as the Japanese flagship. With all 4 Japanese carriers slated for the operation being sunk, the undamaged Japanese battleships returned to Japan. During the return journey, Yamato was attacked by a US submarine, which fired a spread of torpedoes at the battleship. Yamato's side-mounted 6 and 5-inch guns opened up on the contact, but neither side was damaged, and Yamato returned to Japan. The ship basically languished in port for a little while after this point, with even her flagship duties being stripped from her after the commissioning of her sister Musashi in 1942. Although Yamato herself hadn't seen any action at the Battle of Midway, the results of the battle would actually have a major effect on the remaining ships of the class. The two still uncompleted ships, Shinano and No. 111, had already had their construction suspended at the start of the war, with questions being raised about the necessity of having such large battleships in a war that was being increasingly dominated by the aircraft carrier. In the end, the Battle of Midway seemed to confirm Japanese suspicions, and the two remaining ships were ordered to be disposed of, sort of, in one way or another. No. 111, which was only around 30% complete at this point, was ordered to be scrapped on the slipway, with her materials and funds being diverted to the conversion of the two Ise Class battleships into hybrid carriers. Shinano, however, would meet no such fate. The loss of 4 carriers at the Battle of Midway convinced the Japanese Admiralty that instead of scrapping Shinano, she would be converted into a massive aircraft carrier, used for supporting the rest of Japan's operational flat tops. In the meantime, the two already commissioned battleships continued to stay in port, neglecting to try and see any action with the enemy. Although the ship's station was moved from Japan itself to Truk Lagoon to allow them to quickly get themselves to the front lines if the need arose, both Yamato and Musashi were ordered to stay away from combat. The only place where they could have been put to use at this time was as part of a surface bombardment force, trying to attack US positions on Guadalcanal, something that was rightly judged to be far too risky a task to assign to Japan's most valuable capital ships. A feeling that was cemented even further upon the loss of 2 Japanese battleships in the waters around Guadalcanal in late 1942. However, after this point, action started to crop up again for the two ships. With the confined waters off Guadalcanal and the Solomons no longer really existing as a major capital ship theater, Yamato and Musashi were put to use as carrier escorts, spending a good portion of early 1943 However, after this point, action started to crop up again for the two ships. With the confined waters off Guadalcanal and the Solomons no longer really existing as a major capital ship theater, Yamato and Musashi were put to use as carrier escorts, spending a good portion of 1943 and early 1944 sorting out with the Japanese carrier fleet to try and bring the US into battle. On top of this, the large size and bulk of the two battleships made them very useful for the task of transporting troops and supplies to far out Japanese garrisons, and both were also pressed into service in this role. These transport voyages would end up seeing both of the ships get their first damage of the war, as both were torpedoed by US submarines during this time. Yamato was struck in the stern by a torpedo fired from the submarine USS Skate on the 25th of December, whilst Musashi would have her turn in March when she was struck in the bow by a torpedo from USS Tunny. Both ships were put out of action for a good bit by these hits, but none of the damage was crippling, and both ships eventually resumed their normal operations. In February and April of 1944 respectively, the ships would be dry docked for refit and overhaul. Both had radar sets installed aboard, and the wing-mounted 6-inch gun turrets were removed in favor of a strengthened anti-aircraft battery. Following this, the ships would again sortie out in another attempt to lure the Americans into battle, this time forming the main force of what was labeled Operation Kon. Although technically being labeled as a transport run to New Guinea, its real purpose was to try and force the US carrier fleet into battle, using the two Yamato sisters as bait to draw them out. However, this never ended up really coming to anything, and after a brief period of time in which the two battleships nearly collided with each other, Operation Kon was ordered cancelled. The reason for this was that the US carriers had sort of been drawn into battle already, in a different way, as the invasion of Saipan had just commenced. The two Yamato sisters were recalled to join the Japanese carrier fleet that was going to try and fight the Americans in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In the end, this entire plan ended up being really stupid. The Japanese aircraft carriers had not yet had their flight crews trained up well enough to engage the Americans, and the resulting battle ended up being an absolute disaster for Japan. Both Yamato and Musashi fought as hard as they could during the air actions, but in the end, were unable to prevent the disaster and were forced to retreat from the battle. In a grim reminder of how far off the original design purpose of the Yamatos was, the first time their 18-inch guns were fired in combat was not against the service ships that they were designed for, but instead air targets. However, it would not be long at all before the two battleships again got their chance to engage the enemy. Both Yamato and Musashi were assigned a few months later to the Japanese Center Force in preparation for Operation Shogo, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This would be the Japanese Navy's last chance to engage the Americans in a proper fleet action, and they were going to make the most of it. In what was termed by the Japanese to be a sign of imminent victory, a hawk that landed on Yamato's mast was captured by her crew, and hailed as a sign that the Japanese Navy was finally going to succeed in the battle that it most needed to win. The center force set sail for Leyte Gulf on October 15, 1944, bound for the Leyte Gulf. Their plan was to sail through the San Bernardino Strait in the Philippines and enter the Leyte Gulf on the 25th of October, where they would bombard the American landing beaches before withdrawing. However, not everything would immediately go smoothly. Soon after setting sail, the Japanese would lose the heavy cruisers Maya and Atago to submarine attacks, before their force even entered the Philippines' inland waters. Things got even worse a few days later, when the remaining Japanese ships were set upon by US aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea. Yamato herself was struck by 2 armor-piercing bombs, but remained seaworthy. Musashi, however, fared much worse. The huge battleship was damaged and set afire after the first attack wave, and upon the commencement of the second attack, nearly every US aircraft began targeting the wounded battleship. Unfortunately for Musashi, this pattern would continue in the coming waves, and by the end of the US attacks, Musashi had been struck by nearly 17 bombs and a staggering 19 torpedoes. She was still afloat, but just barely. Attempts to beach the ship and fight her as a floating battery came to nothing, and the ship would eventually founder in the dead of night. The rest of Korea's force would continue on and would exit the San Bernardino Strait the next day, only to pretty quickly run into a very small group of US escort carriers patrolling off of the island of Samar. This US carrier group, known as Taffy 3, was caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of a massive Japanese battle force, and immediately did the most sensible thing they could do, and turned tail and ran away, scrambling all of their aircraft skyward at the same time. The Japanese, for their part, were equally as surprised to find such a force in their way, and not having the silhouettes of US escort carriers in their recognition manuals, immediately labeled them as fast fleet carriers and began giving chase. Yamato, having the most advanced fire control of any of the Japanese ships, opened the battle with an 18-inch salvo from 35,000 yards. Minutes later, she would score the first damage of the battle, when an 18-inch round exploded mere feet beneath the keel of the escort carrier White Plains, knocking out her boilers and electrical power and badly warping the ship's hull. After labeling the heavily damaged ship as sunk, Yamato switched her fire to other US carriers. A little while after this, Yamato spotted the destroyer USS Johnston racing away from the Japanese cruiser line after finishing a successful torpedo run on the heavy cruiser Kumano. After dialing down the range for a few minutes with her 6-inch guns, Yamato let loose with a full broadside from her main battery. The result was absolutely devastating. 3 18-inch shells tore through Johnston's deck and engine spaces, crippling a fair portion of the ship's boiler rooms and knocking out most of her main guns. Moments after these impacts, 3 of Yamato's 6-inch shells also struck Johnston, decimating her superstructure and seriously wounding her captain. The destroyer would retreat for the time being into a rain squall, and despite her valiant actions to save the escort carriers later in the battle, she would end up splitting in half along the lines of one of Yamato's 18-inch hits. Her first kill now down, Yamato again switched her fire to the US carriers. This did not last long, however, as the battleship was almost immediately driven away from the battle area by a spread of torpedoes fired by the destroyers USS Hull and USS Heermann, with the battleship also taking 2 5-inch shell hits in the process. Yamato was caught between the 2 torpedo spreads, and was forced to steam away from the battle for around 10 minutes, before turning around and steaming back to the battle for another 10 minutes. Probably a bit pissed off by this massive delay, Yamato almost immediately opened fire again, targeting the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay with her main battery from a range of 20,000 yards. Her gunnery was superb, and her first salvo landed an 18-inch shell that smashed through Gambier Bay's hangar bay. A subsequent hit smashed into Gambier Bay's engine room, and immediately slowed her speed to 10 knots, before rendering her completely inoperable. At the same time, Yamato's 6-inch guns took out the engine room of the destroyer USS Hull, before combined gunfire from her and Nagato finished off the US destroyer. After this point, Gambier Bay was soon to follow, with the stricken carrier eventually capsizing under Yamato's sustained gunfire. However, this sinking pretty much curtailed the end of the battle for the Japanese battleships, as outside of a few small destroyer actions between the opposing screening forces, the Japanese had decided to retreat from the battle area for fear of suffering even more severe damage than... However, this pretty much curtailed the end of the battle for the Japanese battleships, as outside of a few small destroyer actions between the opposing screening forces, the Japanese had decided to retreat from the battle area for fear of suffering even more severe damage from air attacks than they already had. Retreating from the battle, Yamato was again set upon by US aircraft, taking only minor damage because of it, including a US bomb that landed on her turret roof and was completely deflected by its armor. Following this, Yamato spent a brief time operating as a decoy for the Operation Tango convoys, before being returned to Japan. By this point, the naval war was going so badly for the Japanese that nobody really wanted to risk the remnants of the Japanese battle fleet in a proper fleet action again, just yet anyway, and Yamato remained in port. After going into a quick refit to again improve her AA suite, the ship would again be attacked by US aircraft during one of the many air raids on Kure Harbor, with the battleship sustaining one hit to her bridge tower that caused pretty negligible damage. However, it was after this point that all semblance of a calm life, or indeed any life at all, would be rudely swept out from under the battleship and most of her crew. The Japanese, for reasons that are actually still being debated a bit to this day, decided to send out the remnants of their navy on one final suicide mission, very famously known as Operation 10 Ichigo. The purpose and concepts of this plan are so vast and complicated that I really can't hope to do them justice in the scope of this video, but I highly recommend that you do your own research into why this plan was created, as it's some of the most fascinating stuff of the entire war. However, for the sake of time, the essential gist of it was that Yamato, escorted by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, was going to sail down from the home islands and attempt to reach the US landing beaches on the island of Okinawa, in what was essentially a suicide sortie. Nobody in the Japanese Admiralty seriously thought that the plan was actually going to succeed in getting anywhere near close to the island, and its main purpose was really just to distract the US carrier and battleship fleets from an impending mass kamikaze attack that was going to strike them, at hopefully the same time that they were distracted with trying to sink Yamato themselves. Due to the suicide nature of the attack, the commanders of every Japanese ship were under strict orders to make it very clear that every man participating had the choice of whether or not he wanted to stay on the ship and sail out to certain death. Upon this news being delivered on Yamato, not a single member of her crew chose to leave the ship. All were willing to stay and fight to the very end, on the ship that for many years now, many of them had called their home. The Japanese task force left the home waters for the very last time on April 6, 1945, taking with it nearly 3,000 souls to their deaths. The Tango force met the exact fate that was expected of it, and all ships were set upon waves of US carrier aircraft on the next day. Japanese AA defenses were all but overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers the US had thrown skyward, with more aircraft being present to sink Yamato than even the Japanese had employed during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamato fought hard to the last, but eventually the great battleship succumbed to nearly 6 bombs and 11 torpedoes, nearly all of which were directed at her port side. After the massive battle-scarred ship capsized in the water, shells stored in her magazine spaces fell off of their racks and detonated upon making contact with the ship's walls, setting off a chain reaction to her other propellants and shells. The resulting explosion could be seen from the island of UCHUU, nearly 100 miles away, and US aircraft circling around the sinking ship were blown out of the sky by the force of the blast. Nearly 3,055 of her crew went down with the ship, the largest loss of life ever seen on any battleship. To this day, the story of Yamato and her crew still lives on in Japanese culture as symbols of the death of the Japanese Empire itself. Although often made fun of in Western sources, Operation Tango is still generally remembered as one of the most poetic, sad, and yet brave deaths of any battleship in all of history. Her career, design, and death are the 3 things that make Yamato my favorite battleship in all of time. However, she was not the last of these great ships to be seen by Japan. Oh yeah, and also, you might remember how I said that the third ship, Shinano, was being converted into an aircraft carrier in 1942. Well, she was, and eventually the ship would be mostly completed in 1944 after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. However, despite her size and strength, she barely lasted a week in service before being sunk by the submarine USS Archerfish whilst on transfer to Kure. Most fans of the IJN prefer not to think about it. She's a cool ship, but if you're a fan of the IJN, well, her service life is probably best left forgotten. She's still a cool ship though. She's actually the largest aircraft carrier that was completed during World War II. Even as an aircraft carrier, I guess the ships of the Yamato class couldn't help showing off at least a little bit. Alas, we now reach the very end of Japanese battleship design, the A-150 class. This pretty much unnamed class of battleships is very possibly the most mysterious of all battleship designs in all of history, due simply to the fact that nearly all records of their proper design and existence were destroyed before the end of the Second World War. However, what we do know is that the changes that this class made over the Yamatos were mostly very slight, with the main dimensions of the ships, and even their secondary batteries, being mostly the same, besides switching out the dual-purpose 5-inch guns for the much better 4.9-inch weapons. The main change to the ships was the switching out of the 9 18-inch guns for a total of 6 absolutely massive 20-inch guns, the largest ever seen on a warship. Interestingly enough, the turrets and mounts for these guns were ordered to be relatively the same size and shape as those found on the Yamatos, indicating a possible plan to refit the Yamatos with 20-inch guns if that ever became possible. However, like with the B-65s, war intervened with the ship. However, like the B-65s before them, war intervened before these ships could ever be laid down, and only 2 were ever really planned to be built. Tentatively labeled numbers 798 and 799, neither was ever laid down, and the plan to build the ships was eventually scrapped before the end of World War II. Well, there you have it. That's every battleship built, designed, or commissioned for the Japanese Navy. Making this video has been an absolute journey, and it does feel incredible to get to share all this information with you guys, even if I could have done probably a better job of it in some places. On that note, I'd also like to say that it does appear that you finished this video, and that means one of 2 things. Either you fell asleep with autoplay on, or you genuinely enjoyed the video, and if it was the latter, I would very much appreciate it if you would consider subscribing. It would help out the channel an absolute ton, and I'd definitely very much appreciate it. On that note, I'd also like to give a quick shout out to some other small naval YouTubers in the scene right now. If you enjoyed this video, then you'll definitely enjoy their content as well, and I'm sure they'd really appreciate it if you'd show them some support. Especially with the AI takeover that we're seeing with history content on YouTube right now. Anyway, on that mildly grim note, I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Cheers, everybody.